They call him the greatest warrior who ever lived, the immortal hero of the Trojan War, the golden son of a goddess. But strip away the mythology, and Achilles reveals himself as something far more terrifying, a man whose grief transformed him into a butcher, whose rage knew no limits, and whose actions would make even the most hardened soldiers recoil in horror. Born to the sea nymph Thetis and King Peleus, Achilles was destined for glory and an early death. His mother dipped him into the river Styx as an infant, holding him by his heel, the one spot that remained mortal. Trained by Chiron the centaur, he learned not just to kill, but to terrorize. By manhood, he had become the most feared warrior in Greece. When the Greek forces sailed for Troy with Achilles commanding 50 ships of Myrmidon warriors, they unleashed a weapon they would soon discover they couldn't control. For 9 years, he left a trail of corpses across the Trojan plain. But in the 10th year, when personal tragedy struck, Achilles would descend into brutality that shocked even the gods, the massacre of Lessus. Before grief consumed him, Achilles had already established a reputation for exceptional cruelty. The sack of Lessus reveals the man he was before rage stripped away his last restraints. This wasn't battle. It was systematic annihilation. The wealthy city, protected by high walls and defended by king mines, and his brothers, believed they could withstand a siege. Achilles led a direct assault so ferocious the defenders scattered in panic. He personally hunted down the king and his brothers in the streets, making a spectacle of their deaths to ensure everyone understood resistance was futile. Ancient sources record he showed no mercy to those who surrendered. Men who laid down weapons were executed. The elderly were cut down in their homes. This systematic killing wasn't battle frenzy. It was deliberate eradication. Survivors testified that Achilles hunted down even distant relatives of the ruling family to prevent future revenge. The women and children faced a different horror: slavery. Achilles claimed Bruce, King Minos' widow, forcing her to share the bed of her family's killer. She later spoke of watching her entire family die in a single day, her city burned to ashes, then being dragged to serve the man who destroyed everything she loved. The destruction was total. Achilles ordered everything burned: buildings, temples, orchards, fields. This wasn't military necessity. It was erasure. The message to Troy's allies was clear. This is what happens when you oppose us. Archaeological evidence suggests Lynceus was never rebuilt, remaining a ruin for centuries. What makes this massacre chilling is timing. This occurred early in the war, before Achilles had any personal grievance. This was simply how he waged war. Ancient historians record he sacked at least 12 cities, each likely experiencing similar devastation. He was weaponizing fear itself. Years later, Greek commanders fought over Brice for her beauty, but for what she represented. Achilles' most complete victory, when Agamemnon took her, it challenged the entire edifice of terror Achilles had built. The rage that followed would make Lessus look like a minor skirmish. The slaughter of Troas. The death of Troas stands out as particularly cruel, not for how he died, but for who he was. Tros, one of King Priam's youngest sons, barely more than a boy, reveals Achilles at his most calculating. This was planned execution based on prophecy. Troy could never fall if Troilus reached 20. Achilles decided to eliminate this threat, but not in honorable combat. He hunted the boy like prey, waiting for the perfect moment of vulnerability. Tros exercised his horses at Apollo's sanctuary outside the city walls, sacred ground where violence was forbidden. Achilles saw opportunity. At dawn, he emerged from hiding. The unarmed prince tried to flee on horseback, but Achilles pursued with terrifying determination. Ancient Vey paintings depict the chase. Tros riding desperately, while Achilles closes the distance with supernatural speed. The prince reached Apollo's temple, grabbing the altar for sanctuary. Achilles dragged him away, a sacrilege that horrified all Greeks. What happened next varies in accounts, but all agree on brutality. Some say Achilles beheaded him in the temple, blood spattering Apollo's altar. Others describe worse, dragging the boy outside and dismembering him alive. The most detailed account describes methodical mutilation. Tros was torn apart, limbs severed one by one in deliberate silence. Achilles wanted absolute certainty the prophecy could never come true. The boy was so thoroughly destroyed, there could be no question of survival. Troilus' sister, Polyxena, witnessed everything, screaming and pleading for mercy for a boy who'd never fought. Achilles ignored her completely. She escaped and ran to Troy, her clothing soaked in her brother's blood, an image that became a powerful symbol of Achilles' cruelty in ancient art. Apollo cursed Achilles for this sacrilege, ensuring he would die by an arrow guided by the god's hand to his vulnerable heel. But the most disturbing aspect is what it reveals. This wasn't passion or necessity. It was calculated murder of a non-combatant teenager, killed purely because prophecy suggested he might matter. Achilles saw a boy and saw only a problem to eliminate. The death of Peter Troy's transformation. Everything changed when Patroclus died. Before that moment, Achilles was brutal but operated within boundaries. After Patroclus fell to Hector's spear, those boundaries evaporated. What followed was transformation so complete that Achilles became barely human, a creature of pure rage that would commit acts shocking even to gods. Patroclus was more than a companion. Ancient sources are clear. Achilles loved Patroclus more than anyone in the world. They had grown up together, trained together, fought together. The bond between them was Achilles' one vulnerability, the single crack in his armor of pride and violence. When Trojans pushed Greeks back to their ships, Patroclus begged Achilles to return to battle. Achilles refused, pride still wounded by Agamemnon's insult. Patroclus proposed wearing Achilles' armor to terrify the Trojans. Achilles agreed with strict instructions. Drive them from the ships, then return. Don't pursue, just save the fleet and come back alive. Patroclus didn't follow instructions. Swept up in battle's momentum, he pursued Trojans to Troy's walls, killing dozens, including Sarpedon, Zeus's own son. But he'd extended too far. That's when Hector found him. The outcome was inevitable. Patroclus fought bravely but was overwhelmed. Apollo struck him from behind, dazing him, knocking off his helmet and breaking his spear. The Trojan Euphorbus speared him from behind. Then Hector delivered the killing blow, driving his spear through Patroclus' abdomen. As Patroclus died, Hector mocked him. Patroclus' last words were prophecy and curse. Achilles would soon kill Hector in revenge. Then he died and savage fighting erupted over his body. When word reached Achilles, his reaction was one of ancient literature's most powerful passages. He screamed so loudly his mother heard from ocean depths. He threw himself to the ground, tearing his hair, covering himself in dirt and ashes. Warriors had to restrain him from suicide. Thetis rose from the sea and asked what was wrong. Achilles said he wanted to die. Without Patroclus, he had no reason to live, but first he would have revenge. Thetis warned that killing Hector meant his own death would follow. It was fated. Achilles didn't care. He'd kill Hector, even if it meant dying the next day. Seeing her son couldn't be dissuaded. Thetis promised new armor forged by Hephaestus, armor worthy of the slaughter he was about to commit. That night, waiting for dawn and divine armor, Achilles was no longer human. He was a weapon aimed at Troy. The man who'd operated within warrior culture's bounds was gone. In his place was something terrible. A man who'd lost everything and would burn the world to ashes, the river of blood. When Achilles returned to battle, he committed genocide on a scale that literally clogged a river. This wasn't metaphor. Ancient sources described the river's commander becoming so filled with corpses it couldn't flow. Armed with divine armor, Achilles charged like a force of nature. But this wasn't warfare. It was systematic extermination. He cut through Trojans with mechanical efficiency, killing everyone regardless of whether they fought or fled. Warriors who begged for mercy were cut down. Those who ran were speared in the back. Trojans fled toward the river, thinking water would provide protection. They were wrong. Achilles followed into the Scamander itself, turning it into a killing ground. He waded in and continued slaughtering, stabbing, and hacking anyone he could reach. The river filled with bodies, dozens, then hundreds. Water ran red, then turned black with blood and mud as corpses piled up. The Iliad's description is specific. Achilles trapped 12 young Trojan princes alive. We'll return to them. Everyone else he butchered. Bodies formed dams blocking water flow. Corpses caught in reeds along banks. Fish fled or suffocated in contaminated water. Then something unprecedented happened. The river itself became angry. The river god's commander rose in fury at this desecration. The ancient text describes the river demanding Achilles stopped filling his waters with corpses. But Achilles, grief-fueled, didn't even acknowledge the god. He just kept killing. The river attacked. Scamander sent a massive wave directly at Achilles, trying to drown him. Water rose in a wall filled with corpses and debris, crashing down on him. For the first time since Patroclus' death, Achilles felt something like fear. He struggled against the current as the river tried to drag him under. Bodies swirled around him. His divine armor became a liability, weighing him down. The scene became surreal. Achilles fighting not just an army, but the landscape itself. The river summoned its tributary, the Sima. Two rivers focused fury on one man, trying to drown him in a flood of water, blood and corpses. Achilles grabbed a tree to avoid being swept away, but the current ripped it out by its roots. But Achilles had divine protection. Thetis called on Hephaestus, who sent fire Agai. NST water. The forge god created massive conflation along river banks, boiling water and forcing Scamander to retreat. Heat was so intense corpses burned while floating. Fish died in thousands. As the river boiled, trees burst into flame. The entire battlefield became a hellscape of fire and steam. And at its center stood Achilles, still killing. Finally, the river god begged for mercy, promising to stop attacking if the killing would cease. Hystas relented, but Achilles didn't stop. Even as the river retreated, even as divine forces withdrew, he continued his rampage. He'd come to kill Trojans until he found Hector, or until no Trojans remained. The aftermath was apocalyptic. Days were needed to clear the river of bodies stacked 3 and 4 deep. The smell was unbearable. Fish and wildlife died in massive numbers. Even the Greeks were shocked. This wasn't warfare. It was something far worse. Slaughter belonging to monsters, not men. The 12 sacrifices of all Achilles' atrocities. Perhaps none was more calculated than what he did to 12 young Trojan princes. These weren't warriors killed in battle or enemies executed after defeat. They were captives taken alive specifically for ritual murder. During his rampage through the Scamander, Achilles encountered 12 young nobles, princes and sons of important families, too young to be primary defenders, but old enough to be on the battlefield. Finding them trapped, terrified and defenseless, he made a shocking decision. Take them out. Ancient sources record his exact words. He told the captives they would be payment for patrol's blood. These weren't prisoners for ransom or slaves for sale. They were designated for human sacrifice. The 12 were bound hand and foot and led to the Greek camp, knowing they were marked for death, but not knowing when or how it would come. They were held for days while Achilles hunted Hector. They heard battle sounds, dying screams, reports of how many Trojans Achilles was killing daily. Ancient sources suggest some tried bargaining for their lives, offering any ransom. Achilles refused to even discuss it. Their fate was decided the moment he pulled them from the river. When Achilles finally killed Hector, he began preparations for Patroclus' funeral, the most elaborate rites ever witnessed. That's when the 12 young Trojans were brought out to the massive funeral. The sacrifice was even more brutal than they could have imagined. Achilles didn't execute them quickly. He made it a ritual. The young men were brought forward one by one, while the entire Greek army watched. Achilles personally cut their throats one after another, letting blood spill onto Petra's ancient description, emphasized the methodical nature, not frenzied violence, but careful, deliberate ritual murder. Each was held in place while Achilles drew his blade across their throat, then pushed forward. To bleed out on the screams from Troy's walls were audible, even at the Greek camp. Families could see, from the city's high walls. They watched sons and brothers butchered one by one and thrown onto a like animals. King Priam and Queen Hecuba were forced to witness some of their younger sons and grandsons murdered in this barbaric ritual, powerless to intervene. What makes this particularly heinous? Human sacrifice was considered abhorrent even in ancient Greece. Greeks practiced animal sacrifice regularly, but deliberately killing humans as offerings was viewed as barbaric. When Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia for favorable winds, it was done secretly and haunted him. Achilles performed his human sacrifices in broad daylight before the entire army and felt no shame. After cutting all 12 throats, Achilles placed the bodies on the around Patroclus. He also killed horses, dogs, and cattle, but the young Trojans were the centerpiece. As flames rose, Achilles stood watching for hours, face expressionless. The smoke was visible for miles. Even Greeks, hardened by brutal warfare, found the sacrifice excessive and disturbing. Some questioned whether Achilles had gone too far, whether grief had driven him mad, but no one dared confront him directly. He was too dangerous, too essential for victory. They swallowed objections and looked away, becoming complicit. The 12 victims' families never recovered their bodies. They burned to ash on Petra's remains mixed with animals and wood, impossible to separate. This denied them proper burial rites essential in Greek culture, adding final insult. These young men were erased, reduced to nameless sacrifices. The hunting of Hector. After Patroclus' funeral, with 12 princes' ashes still warm, Achilles turned full attention to Hector. But he didn't just want to kill him in battle. He wanted to hunt him, terrorize him, make him feel the same fear and helplessness Patroclus must have felt. Hector knew what was coming. After killing Patroclus, he'd briefly worn Achilles' armor as a trophy. But that pride now marked him as the world's most dangerous killer's primary target. He'd watched Achilles' slaughter through the Trojan army, seen the river of blood, witnessed the human sacrifices. He knew when they met, there would be no mercy. The confrontation began with psychological warfare. Achilles positioned himself in full view of Troy's walls and called out Hector by name. But this wasn't respectful warrior's challenge. It was public shaming. Achilles mocked Hector, calling him a coward for hiding, questioning his manhood, insulting his family. The taunts were designed to force Hector out, making refusal impossible. Without losing all honor, Hector's father, aged King Priam, begged his son not to go from the walls. Priam could see what Achilles had become. The madness in his eyes, blood staining his armor. He pleaded with Hector to stay inside, even falling to his knees. An old king, humiliating himself to save his son's life. But honor and duty were a trap Hector couldn't escape. He was Troy's greatest defender. Refusing to face Achilles would collapse the city's morale. When Hector emerged, Achilles didn't immediately attack. He stalked toward his prey, slowly, deliberately, like a predator, knowing the victim has no escape. Ancient sources describe his appearance: divine armor blazing in sunlight, spear ready, eyes locked on Hector with absolute focus. He looked like a god of death made flesh. Then something unexpected happened. Hector ran. This warrior who'd fought bravely for 10 years, who'd killed Patroclus himself, turned and fled. It wasn't cowardice, but animal instinct for survival overriding everything. Achilles pursued, not trying to end it quickly, but maintaining distance, hurting Hector like a predator toying with prey. 3 times they circled Troy's walls. 3 times Hector ran for his life while both armies watched in stunned silence. Achilles could have ended any time. He was faster, stronger, better. But he deliberately prolonged the chase. He wanted Hector exhausted, terrified, broken. He wanted everyone to see Hector humiliated. Watching Trojans were in agony. They watched their greatest hero hunted like an animal. Unable to help, forced to witness his humiliation, Priam and Hecuba screamed from the walls, begging gods to intervene. The gods remained silent. Finally, exhausted and realizing there was no escape, Hector stopped running. He turned to face Achilles. Finding some courage and desperation, he proposed terms. Whoever won would treat the loser's body with respect, returning it for proper burial. It was reasonable by heroic warfare standards. Achilles' response was chilling. He told Hector there would be no agreements, no terms, no mercy. He'd kill Hector and feed his body to dogs and vultures. He wished he could eat Hector's flesh raw himself. The fight was brief and brutal. Hector threw his spear first, a good throw that bounced off Achilles' divine shield. Achilles threw his spear. Hector dodged. Hector drew his sword and charged, but Achilles retrieved his spear. Athena had returned it and faced Hector armed, while the Trojan was reduced to his sword. Achilles steadied Hector's armor, looking for a gap. Finding it at the collarbone, Achilles drove his spear into that gap with precision, puncturing Hector's throat, but deliberately missing the windpipe so Hector could still speak. As Hector fell, bleeding but conscious, he used his last breaths to beg, "Return my body to my father for burial." Achilles promised exactly the opposite. He told the dying Hector his body would be desecrated, that dogs would tear his flesh, that he'd never receive funeral rites, allowing his soul to find peace. Hector died hearing those words, knowing his worst fear would be realized. But Achilles wasn't finished. As Hector's soul left, he immediately began the promised desecration. His atrocities remind us civilization is a thin veneer, that grief and rage can transform anyone into something terrible, and that the greatest warriors are often the greatest monsters. The story of Achilles isn't ancient history. It's a warning echoing through every war, every act of vengeance, every moment when pain transforms into cruelty. His legend survives not because we should admire him, but because we must never forget what he truly was: a hero who became a horror, a warrior who lost his humanity in glory's pursuit, and a man whose most lasting legacy is a reminder of how easily we can all become monsters.